Today we are going to learn about an American artist, Andrew Wyeth. This video will be exploring how he became a painter, but more important the 4 women in his life that shaped his art. I'm going to warn you, some of the content might be a little racy for some, nothing that you won't see in a museum. I will keep it as tasteful as I can. Without understanding these relationships, we can't understand Wyeth. You have heard stories of how one woman shaped the world, like Helen of Troy. The face that launched 1,000 ships. The Spartan queen, seduced by the son of a Trojan king, leaving her husband to send Greek sailors and soldiers to retrieve her, and kicking off an epic and bloody war. In Wyeth's story it was 4 women, Betsy, who became his wife. Christina, she had a degenerative muscular disorder which meant that she had not been able to walk since she was about 30 years old. She stayed away from a wheelchair and crawled wherever she wanted to go. This created one of the best known paintings in American history. The next was not a woman but a girl. Siri was only 14 when Wyeth started painting her, and some were nudes, said to be suggested by Betsy. The last one was Helga. He kept her a secret from Besty for years. We'll explore how he did this later in the video.
The Sunday Painter.
While doing this, you can check out Age Limited's Relaxed Vintage Artists t-shirts to look good when making a statement. There are many other items such as mouse pads, phone covers and coffee mugs with many other cool items. If you don't see something, make a suggestion in the comments. The link can be found in the description below the video or in the upper right corner of the Sunday banner. Have some creative fun. An American visual artist, primarily a realist painter, he was one of the best-known U.S. artists of the middle 20th century. Andrew Newell Wyeth. Born July 12, 1917, Wyeth was the youngest of the 5 children of illustrator and artist N.C. Wyeth. N.C. Wyeth, his father was a great American artist and illustrator. During his lifetime, N.C. Wyeth created more than 3,000 paintings and illustrated 112 books. So, Wyeth had a strong artistic house to grow up in. His work has a haunting, stark realism that leaves the viewer feeling disturbed and unsure of what once may have been beyond doubt. The family was close, spending time reading together, taking walks, fostering a closeness with nature and developing a feeling for Wyeth family history. Wyeth was home tutored because of his frail health. Like his father, the young Wyeth read and appreciated the poetry of Robert Frost and the writings of Henry David Thoreau and studied their relationships with nature. Music and movies also heightened his artistic sensitivity. Wyeth's father was the only teacher that he had. Due to being schooled at home, he led both a sheltered life and one that was obsessively focused. Wyeth recalled of that time, "Pa kept me almost in a jail, just kept me to himself in my own world, and he wouldn't let anyone in on it. I was almost made to stay in Robin Hood's Sherwood Forest with Maid Marian and the rebels." Wyeth started drawing at a young age. He was a draftsman before he could read. By the time he was a teenager, his father brought him into his studio for the only art lessons he ever had and inspired his son's love of rural landscapes, sense of romance, and artistic traditions. Although creating illustrations was not a passion he wished to pursue, Wyeth produced illustrations under his father's name while in his teens. He mastered figure study and watercolor and later learned egg tempera from his brother-in-law Peter Hurd. He studied art history on his own, admiring many masters of Renaissance and American painting, especially Winslow Homer. In 1937, at age 20, Wyeth had his first one-man exhibition of watercolors at the Macbeth Gallery in New York City. The entire inventory of paintings sold out, and his life path seemed certain. His style was different from his father's, sparer, drier, and more limited in color range. This gives his work a dusty pale minimalistic feel that Wyeth is so famous for. In October 1945, his father and his 3-year-old nephew, Newell Convers Wyeth II, were killed when their car stalled on a railroad track near their home and was struck by a train. Wyeth referred to his father's death as a formative emotional event in his artistic career, in addition to being a personal tragedy. In the Life magazine article in 1965, Wyeth said that, although he was thought of as a realist, he thought of himself as an abstractionist. "My people, my objects breathe in a different way. There's another core, an excitement that's definitely abstract." He worked predominantly in a regionalist style. In his art, Wyeth's favorite subjects were the land and people around him, both in his hometown of Chaddsford, Pennsylvania, and at his summer home in Cushing, Maine. He gravitated to several identifiable landscape subjects and models. His solitary walks were the primary means of inspiration for his landscapes. Wyeth developed an extraordinary intimacy with the land and sea and strove for a spiritual understanding based on history and unspoken emotion. He typically created dozens of studies on a subject in pencil or loosely brushed watercolor before executing a finished painting, either in watercolor, a dry brush style, a watercolor style in which the water is squeezed from the brush, or egg tempera. If you study his works, you may feel the loneliness as I do. Let's take a look at his technique. He worked in watercolor and egg tempera, working on a medium rough watercolor paper which he has made up in blocks, 22x 30 inch. He objects to stretched paper, says he believes it loses its capacity for brilliant effects. All his paintings are done with 3 sable brushes, number 5, 10, and 15. He never uses those broad flat brushes so many artists employ for large, covering washes. Using the dry brush technique, he would apply a very small amount of damp paint to a brush, using no water or medium to dilute the paint. He would then painstakingly create small details in his paintings with the very tip of a brush. On his egg tempera technique. These are done on macéonite upon which 3 coats of whiting mixed with casein glue are applied as a ground. The pulverized glue is heated, in water, in a double boiler. Wyeth sandpapers the final coat to a very smooth finish. The panel is made rigid by a framework attached to the back. He painted with dry colors mixed on his palette, as he works, with distilled water and egg yolk. His procedure is to make a monochrome underpainting in black ink. The egg tempera colors were applied over this black and white, have a quality of weight and depth preferred to the result of direct painting in color. This is in accordance with the traditional method of old masters who used this medium. Through his tempera paintings he is acquiring the habit of accuracy and is seeking an intimacy with nature which he feels he cannot attain with his watercolor brush alone. Thus, fortified he believes his watercolors, though painted in a burst of enthusiasm, are more likely to be informed and interesting in every detail. Too often, he says, a watercolor appeals solely by virtue of tricks and fortuitous beauties inherent in the medium itself. My aim is to make every part of the picture alive, interesting. As I said before, his work has a haunting, stark realism that leaves the viewer feeling disturbed and unsure of what once may have been beyond doubt. Now we are going to take a look at the 4 women that shaped Wyeth's life and art. The first woman on this list will be Betsy, his wife. On Wyeth's 22nd birthday he ventured to Cushing to meet the artist Merle James, but instead met James' 17-year-old daughter Betsy. Instantly smitten, he asked her to show him around town, and she was more than happy to oblige. Throughout his life Wyeth had a rather contentious relationship with women, indeed, with anyone who didn't in some way directly support his painting. Like Andrew, Betsy had health problems as a child and grew up a loner. "I was the flawed child," she said. They married in May 1940, and she was initially dismissed by Andrew's domineering father as a lightweight dilettante. She would prove his father and the rest of Wyeth's family wrong, becoming not only Andrew's wife and model, but his staunchest supporter and most severe critic, his business manager and eventually his archivist. Betsy's interest in architecture, history, islands, cooking, birdwatching, and knitting are evident in many of Andrew's paintings. "Andy Wyeth never would have become Andrew Wyeth without her," said longtime family friend and photographer Peter Ralston of Rockport, who grew up across the street from the Wyeths. "She created the worlds in which they lived." Andy had a vision for a painting and would go at it with pencil and paper and egg tempera and watercolor. She would participate in the work and often named his paintings and learned to express her strong opinion about his art. She made a significant contribution to the study of American art. Betsy and Andrew Wyeth founded the Wyeth Endowment for American Art, the precursor to the Wyeth Foundation for American Art, in 1968. It is now the 3rd largest funder of exhibitions, publications, and fellowships devoted to the study of American art. She was a remarkable woman. I'm going to spend time and learn more about her. The second woman on the list is Christina Olson. He meets Christina when Betsy introduced him on the same day he meets Betsy. Betsy knew that the Olsons were difficult, reclusive people. Wyeth, however, was completely unfazed by their dilapidated house, and as he later recalled, owing to Christina's real fondness for Betsy, she accepted me much more readily than I suppose she ordinarily would have. By this time Christina, who had an undiagnosed neuromuscular disease, likely polio, was reduced to crawling. Wyeth however felt that she was so much bigger than all the little idiosyncrasies. And found her a symbol of fierce independence and extraordinary conquest of life. The result of this friendship was Christina's World, one of the iconic paintings of the 20th century. When I saw this painting many years ago, I found it odd. The girl laying in the field looking up at an old house. Now I know that Christina crawled everywhere and that was just her going home, which endears the painting to my heart. I never looked at this painting called Christina's World the same way again. Andrew and Betsy spent their winters in Chadds Ford, Pennsylvania and their summers in Cushing, where he routinely returned to the Olsons and their saltwater farm as a subject. He eventually had free run of their house, even setting up his studio in an upstairs bedroom. I have pictures of the house today and some of the paintings he painted of Christina's home. Christina's death in January 1968 deeply affected Wyeth and marked the end of a seminal 2-decade-long period in his painting. This nondescript saltwater farmhouse and its connecting structure has become one of the most recognized images in American art. The weather-beaten house by the coast is a symbol of both the strength and rusticity of Maine. Take a minute and look over this little saltwater farm and I think you will appreciate it as much as I do. The next girl is Siri. After the death of Christina, Wyeth was faced with a blank canvas, as it were. It was time for a reappraisal of his art. It was then that he met Siri, the daughter of the Cushing farmer George Erickson. Siri was exotic, untouched and had an electrifying effect on his work. A burst of life, he later said, like spring coming through the ground, a rebirth of something fresh out of death. It was Betsy who pushed him to do nudes. Because his model was only 14 years old it became, as you could imagine, something of a scandal. Siri Erickson had nothing to do with any of them, a very young girl from the Finnish community of Cushing. In the fall of 1967, Wyeth, along with his wife Betsy, came to the farm of Siri's father, George Erickson, to inspect the building on his territory. They were thinking of buying it. While George and Betsy were exploring the barn, Wyeth noticed the blonde farmer's daughter standing in the doorframe with a cat and immediately began to draw her. A few months later, in January 1968, the artist returned to Cushing for the funeral of his friend Christina Olson. When he returned to the Olson house after the funeral, he saw the Erickson estate, surrounded on all sides by huge pine trees, and remembered Siri. The rest of the day I kept thinking how that young girl is doing there. Wyeth wrote. Once he returned to Maine in the late spring of 1968, he contacted Siri to ask her to pose. Wyeth painted Siri for 10 years until Betsy, worried that their relationship had turned sexual, put a stop to it. She told Wyeth, "If you do this again, don't tell me." Her request would have rather far-reaching consequences because Andrew had just met Helga. I could not find many works on Siri even after 10 years of painting. The fourth woman on the list is Helga. Helga was born in Königsberg, Prussia in 1939. After surviving the war her family was held as prisoners in Denmark. At age 16 she entered the convent but left a few years later and met John Testorff. They married, moved to Philadelphia and finally settled in Chadds Ford. By the time she met Wyeth she was a lonely, unhappy, homesick housewife and posing for Wyeth was her answer. "I became alive," she said, "it shows in the pictures. I became young overnight. I've never done anything more worthwhile." Wyeth spent the next 15 years painting Helga in near complete secrecy. To hide her from Betsy he shuttled her from studio to studio, like a hamster in a cage, and began finding excuses to remain in Chadds Ford while Betsy was in Maine. What few pieces he showed Betsy carefully concealed Helga's identity. He even changed her skin color. The beauty of Helga portraits lies in the harmony and exceptional trust that was there between the artist and his muse. Wyeth celebrated quietly being in Helga's presence, watching her breathe, sit, sleep, exist. The dazzling Prussian girl, as the painter used to call his muse, regularly barricaded herself in the secondary reality that was accessible only for her and the inspired artist. Place that felt like asylum, and run away from all that's ordinary, usual and deprived of magic. Wyeth never really intended to show his works publicly. This is what he confirmed during the only interview on Helga Matter. "My intention was to keep them hidden away until I died," he says, "then they could be revealed." Eventually he tired of the deception and showed his work, some 240 pieces, to Betsy. Her first reaction was that I was absolutely overcome, and what she said next was, "Who the bleep is this woman?" You can add in the bleep if you want. As the artist explained during the interview with Hoving, I knew right away that I wanted this relationship if it worked to be a secret. Because I didn't want anyone to know that I have fallen deeply in love. The difference between me and a lot of painters is that I have to have a personal contact with my models. I don't mean a sexual love, I mean real love. Helga, on the other hand, turned out to be this persistent, restless and most patient model that any artist could dream of. She understood the importance of her role, was discreet, deeply engaged with her whole being in the process of creation. When Betsy was asked what she thought of the relationship of her husband with the model, she replied, "All I see is love." Between Wyeth and Betsy is this rare, unique mutual understanding that only real soulmates could achieve, something that made it all work. They sold the entire collection to the publisher Leonard E. B. Andrews, and in a masterful piece of public relations the story spread beyond art circles, with the salacious details of Wyeth's secret model becoming the simultaneous cover story in both Time and Newsweek. I hope you enjoyed the video and learned something new. Thanks for watching.